Welcome to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers for dog trainers or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.
Episode 8, which training collar is best? Let me dive into, I did this blog post a while back, and it was Prong Collar versus ECollar, the how they're similar, how they're different. And we'll get into other types of collars too. I just wanted to, since I've already written this and it was like in my head.
These are two, like the two hot buzz.
Yeah.
You know, the most controversial collars. So we'll talk about these a little bit more because it's important that people are educated on these tools, because used properly, they can actually make a huge difference for most people who go, I've tried everything and my dog still doesn't listen. I guarantee they didn't try these two collars.
Right. Or they were reluctant, or
they were reluctant, or they didn't use it properly. Go ahead.
So I'm going to break this down to on leash and off leash, because of course I get this question a surprising amount of time. If you consider ECollar, that doesn't necessarily mean that your dog is guaranteed to be an off-leash dog. You can have an ECollar on and a leash. So when we talk about on-leash training, prong collars and ECollars, the difference, the way that I've seen it in my experience, is they can do a similar job, but the prong collar on a leash can be a little simpler because it kind of happens on its own. If a dog is pulling, he runs into the end of his leash, the prong collar is gonna grab his attention before you really even need to do anything. It's doing it for you. You basically have to sit still. The ECollar, you have to sit there and hit a button, which means one hand on button, one hand on leash, and it can get a little clumsy, but it does have its benefit because, of course, ECollars can be dragged out in terms of a correction. You can press and hold a button for a while, whereas a prong collar, in order to be effective, it has to be sharp, pop, 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 not literally sharp, but sharp in it.
They're just momentary correction.
Correct.
That's all you have.
Right. And that's when you need to kind of assess, does my dog respond well to these momentary corrections, or do they respond a little easier to the kind of, more sparsed out, longer form correction? And you can still correct momentarily with an ECollar. That's worth noting too. But again, in my experience, a prong collar tends to be simpler for people. It's got less of a harsh learning curve to it, and it's way cheaper. That's a cool one. They're endlessly reliable. It's a piece of stainless steel. It's really hard to mess that up.
Yeah. However, they do look like medieval torture devices. We'll be very upfront with that.
Some people like that.
Some people are into
okay, well,
your girlfriend. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
She can't hear you, thank God.
Okay, good. Thank you, Lord.
She hears me though. So okay, but here's a real one though. Here's a real cool one. Prong collars, because this can matter to people. Not only are they cheaper, but they come in cool different colors and things like that. I've seen black powder coats or sage green powder coats. Sometimes that matters to people, And I've even seen some, I don't know how effective they are, so keep this in mind, but I have seen some that it's a full-on prong collar covered by a collar, a nylon just collar. So it's hidden away. Yeah, like Velcro collar. Or something, right. Yeah. So in terms of efficiency on a leash, they're pretty neck and neck, I would say.
Badoom. Neck and neck. You're hilarious.
Here's a downside that I've seen for each of these collars. Okay, so a downside for the prong collar, I've noticed this most in either really high drive or short fur, or a combination of the two dogs. A high driven dog with short fur on a prong collar can irritate their neck. Whereas the
if they require a lot of reminding.
Right. Correct. Right. Yeah. So that's when you kind of have to judge, whether your dog is more capable of listening to this versus this. Because I had a few dogs who did well on a prong collar. Don't get me wrong, did really well. But then I moved them to the ECollar and they did much better with much less correcting, no issues with their neck and stuff like that. But on ECollars, you still do have to be careful, because if you have the wrong contact, I made that mistake, put the wrong contact points on a dog, or, you leave it on for too long, or you leave it on and stupid little things happen that inevitably will happen. It died and you didn't realize it. So you go to push the button and, oh shit, here we go. Nothing's happening. With that being said, when we consider off-leash work, ECollars have abilities that prong collars don't. How do I correct my dog when he's whining in the crate and I'm downstairs? How do I correct my dog when he's in the yard and I'm telling him to come inside and he doesn't listen? How do I stop my dog from bolting out of the door? And if he does, what do I do? So off-leash capability is a huge thing, but of course, when you're working up to off-leash, that's only for a certain amount of people, only for a certain amount of dogs. Not everybody wants off-leash, even if their dog necessarily would be capable of it, unless we're talking a dog park, which is closed in.
Right.
So just a few things to keep in mind, and I'm sure that you have some input that you want to toss in there.
Yeah, yeah. I guess if we're talking about the pros and cons of prong collars, e-collars, I remember when I first started doing e-collar, I think, or learning about e-collar, I was so surprised to find out that some dogs were allergic to certain, contact points, right? And when I found out that they made titanium and they made all these different points that affected, and I remember it being such a huge game changer because, some of the common complaints for these collars are like, okay, a e-collar will leave burn marks on your dog, right?
Yeah.
And if you guys have had experience with an e-collar or you've accidentally left it too long, they're not burn marks. It's called necrosis. In other words, it's a pressure sore, right? So it's kind of like, why do old people who sit in hospital beds or who are bedridden, why do you have to turn them? Is because if not, they'll develop sores on their butt cheeks, on their hips, on their sides, because the pressure is on it for so long,
Right.
that the tissue actually starts dying. So that is a downside. So you do have to be more on top of your e-collar. You need to make sure you find the right points for your dog's fur. So you definitely do need a dog trainer to consult with, to at least ask him what's the right points. What should I do to make sure that it's consistent and it's safe? And also you need to make sure you're charging it. You need to make sure that everything's working and everything's paired properly. So anytime you're dealing with technology, you do have to become a little tech savvy in that field. When we're dealing with prong collars, one of the downside that we see, again, one of the complaints that people will say is that the spikes are actually are stabbing into the dog, and it totally makes sense why people think this. But if you guys have ever actually used a prong collar, the spikes, given the specific brand, our brand of choice is Hermspringer. I think that is across the board of professional dog trainers. Hermspringer, the German steel brand, is wonderful. They have about 100 years in this industry, not just making dog tools, but they make tools for horses, and they make riding gear and all this other stuff. So it's not the spikes that create the marks on the dog's neck. It's actually the chain mechanism on the dog's neck that creates. Now you can see the same irritation with choke chains. You can see the same irritation with martingales. Anything that has a chain mechanism, unfortunately what happens is the dog's skin and fur will get pulled through the chain, and to the naked eye it will totally look like, especially for a prong collar is always the culprit, it will seem like that welt or that missing bit of hair or that irritated spot on the dog's neck was created by the points of the prong collar. And that's just not the case. The only time the prong collar will actually leave marks on the dog's neck is if it's left on too tight for long periods of time.
Right. Or too loose. That's a big one too.
Or too loose. This is true. And so those are some of the negatives, and that's kind of why, these two things are kind of open for scrutiny. But again, every tool is just a tool. It's how you use it. And if you use it wrong, then, people are totally going to have opinions on it. And I understand, I have empathy for people who have opinions on it. However, it is still important for people to educate themselves on these tools, so that way they can look out for those things.
Yeah, and can I give one more pro to the prong collar, or two more pros, I guess, because when we talk about like the titanium tips for the e-collars for dogs that are allergic to the stainless steel, because dogs can be allergic to prong collars too, but they also make prong collars in different metals. Like Kurgan is a metal that they've made prong collars out of. Or there's a few different types of metals that don't have like this or that type of base metal that dogs would be allergic to.
Right.
So you still have options even if your dog has like a skin allergy. But
Sure.
Here's a big pro for prong collars, or at least for having a dog on leash. Even if you're going to have an e-collar, it's still good to have a dog on a leash. Is the prong collar is basically fail-proof, meaning if I had a dog on an e-collar and he bolts after another dog, if all my training is done and all his recall and everything is down pat and I know his levels and everything is good, I can grab that dog's attention. I'm confident. But
Right.
I've met people. In fact, my dog Simba and I were out, and my neighbor's dog, it wasn't at home. We were actually both just happened to be at the park. My neighbor's dogs come bolting at us, and I can hear him yelling at them, both of them. It was Kobe and it was like Mamba, and it was like Kobe, come, other dog, come. He's pushing away his little e-collar button. I can see the collars on the dogs, and I can see that they're so loose, like regular collars. They're just kind of doing this, and it was crazy because once the collar just like happened to connect with the dog, he went boom, and then kept coming for us anyway. So,
oh man.
so this was like early in Simba's training. I hadn't done ECollar yet, so I still had him on a prong. Whereas he, of course, sees two dogs flying at us. He wants to, go back, but he's going nowhere. I don't care how like bad he wants to go. He can't bully his way through my prong collar. I'm holding him. I mean, bar of like pulling me over or
because the dog's attached to you in that scenario.
Right.
So it is foolproof in that sense. I totally get that. And the dog, and it's easier for you to keep that dog next to you in those scenarios.
Right. So keep that one in mind.
Yeah, I'm going to play a little devil's advocate, right? Okay. Because I want to make sure that this this podcast stays as educational as possible, okay. Right? Sometimes there's been wrong calls that dog trainers make, right? They might put the dog on the wrong collar, and we might say that the dog is too sensitive. I remember one time I put a dog on an ECollar who could literally feel it at a level 1. Which was nuts. Which, like, guys, those of you who have ever worked with ECollars, at level 1 is almost impossible for humans to perceive. But this dog could. So I had to have a workaround. There was a situation where I put a prong collar on a dog, and the dog completely had no idea how to handle that type of control that the dog had on them. So we have to also kind of make these calls from dog to dog. We are going to see that different dogs have different sensitivity levels. Different dogs have different sensitivity levels specifically around the neck. Mm-hmm. Like, I've met dogs who are bowling balls, English bulldogs, Frenchies, who are just tough little son of a guns. And you can literally pick them up, throw them in the air. They body slam other dogs and they chew each other on, their paws and the rest of their body. But if you put something around that dog's neck, that dog is going to freak the hell out. Right. And so not always is this a result of the training collar. Sometimes it's just a result of the dog's lack of exposure to something being around his neck. So you might see this with dogs who have, maybe never always been on a harness. Right. And then for the first time, we're putting something around their neck. Or you might see it like on a young puppy who is just being introduced to a collar for the first time. So yeah, I just want to tell people that when we're using some of the more attention grabbing collars, it is possible that the dog may not be ready for them as well. Okay. So thank you for listening to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers for dog trainers, or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.
See you next time.